So I know this doesn't sound very empowering. However, I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't have a means of empowering you to overcome this obstacle. And this obstacle, whether you admit it or not, is there. For the love of humanity, and because you and I are so intimately connected, let's get deep with the Daily Empowerment Podcast. Daily empowerment to empower you to be wise, to be brave, and to be beautiful. Out of the 6 possible responses to a question, the one we don't necessarily have to worry about is when we know the answer. But the other 5, where there's either uncertainty or we don't have the right answer, we do have to think about how we respond. Now, whether the answer is right or wrong is a binary response or a binary outcome. It's either going to be right or wrong, 1 or 0, 1 or 2, heads or tails. However, the probability that our confidence about the probability of us being right changes depending on which one of those 6 is actually happening. Now, even when we think we know the right answer and we actually do, because we can think we know the right answer and actually don't, it still reduces the probability of the confidence coefficient that we're confident about that answer, that we can be confident about when we know the answer and we believe do, because there's always a possibility that we believe we know the answer and we don't. So I know this doesn't sound very empowering. However, I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't have a means of empowering you to overcome this obstacle. And this obstacle, whether you admit it or not, is there. This gives us an opportunity to confront it and deal with it in a very logical and thought out way. So I've already been preparing you to deal with this. The first 2 things we talked about when dealing with a question is confirming that we understand the question and then inquiring about the real reason the question was asked, the reasoning behind it, context. And once again, the only reason we actually have to get into any of this is because the pattern of questioning and answering has not been built in our society in such a way that it helps to build a wise method of answering of questions and answers. All right, our teachers would almost rather have us get it wrong than to hold off on giving a response until our response is adequate. Right? You either know it then or you don't know it at all. And that doesn't actually bring us to a more enlightened, a wiser society. So out of the 6, what we want to do is kind of switch up a little bit. Instead of saying that we don't know the answer or that we do know the answer, first thing is whether or not we know a reference, a source, something that has led us to believe that answer. If we can begin to think, instead of whether or not we know the answer, as to whether or not there is a source that we can turn to back it up, we begin to build a wiser response to questions. So I'm going to go through a couple of these real quick. Now, if you're a professional, I'm going to get into how we gear this more towards a professional level, but in everyday question and answering, you can always say, I believe I know the answer to whatever the question is. If I recall correctly, then I state the source, would tend to show that the answer X is correct. So if we look back at that scenario where I had asked for directions and Miss had given them to me, she might say, after first verifying that she understood the question, so you want directions to Old Mill Park? And I would answer yes. She might say, if you don't mind me asking, why do you want to go there? For an eventual picnic. And then she could say, I believe I know the answer, or I believe I know the directions to Old Mill Park. If I recall correctly, out of the many times I've been there, from my GPS, it would tend to show that if you take this street, that street, so on and so forth, or her other response was that if memory serves correctly, during this time of year, that place is very windy. So if you're looking for a place to have a good picnic, it would tend to show that that's not the best location. You could try X. Right, so she referred to her memory, which is just fine. She referred to her life experience, which is just fine. That can be a source. But in a more professional setting, what you may want to do even from there is that, say if you're not sure you know the answer, or even when you do, or more simply, I think this answer might work for the majority of it. It's that, please let me review my resources. So whether you know the answer or not, you should always probably have that resource to be able to show them, tell them, refer to. So please let me review my resources and I'll get back to you to confirm the answer. So it doesn't say that you didn't know, it doesn't say you don't have access, it doesn't belittle the confidence they may have in you. It simply says, please let me review my resources and I'll get back to you after I confirm my answer. So these responses need not be a word for word of what I'm telling you right now. But if we want to become one of the sages of humanity, if we want to be an example of wisdom, to help encourage others to live life more wisely, to do wiser things, to be a more enlightened humanity, then go ahead and practice these out loud by yourself or with somebody you trust. I want to thank you for getting deep with me by listening to this episode of the Daily Empowerment Podcast. Daily Empowerment to empower you to be wise, to be brave, and to be beautiful. Remember, the views presented here may or may not be those of our management company or our affiliates, and any information you hear should first be reviewed by the corresponding professional. Whether that's medical, legal, or financial, before applying it to your life, all rights are reserved by the content's creator.